Hello, hello.
Hey,
This is Oscar.
hey, how's it going?
Hey, Tweek. Thanks so much for taking my session. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Is there anything you'd like
Yep.
to chat about before we get into it, or would you prefer to get into some games and go from there?
Yeah, I'd say start with some games, and
Okay.
we'll use that as a starting point.
Okay, if you have questions at any point, feel free to stop me at any point, and obviously, I'll mention anything as we go as well. But we should be good to go.
Y- Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, just a heads up. I'm not your typical Smash player. I'm a little bit on the older side. I'm like 33 years old, but I love this game and I enjoy the whole scene, and I just want to get better. So.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'm sure I could try my best to help.
You got one. I don't got one. Nice.
I know one thing you mentioned uh, specifically was disadvantage state. There's a couple key things. I feel like disadvantage state is a really big part of the Metafy lessons I do. And to
Yep.
start off, just from like the first couple games we play, when I get a hit, you're very quick to like burn a key resource out of hit stun. Whether that's like in this case, it's usually like an immediate jump.
Right.
Um, and there's a lot to talk about when it comes to something like that. Basically, the key is to avoid burning resources if you don't necessarily have to. So a perspective I
Right.
really try to push when it comes to these lessons is making your opponent work as hard as possible for their hits, rather than like guessing or just like wasting resources. An example I use all the time is let's say Captain Falcon is up airing you over and over in like a combo.
Yep.
What you do immediately out of hit stun is really key, right? Like let's say you air dodge, that's where you can get like forward aired or spiked, right? And you just lose your stock. And what's funny
Yeah.
about that is you're like preemptively immediately doing that out of hit stun, right? Whether it's a jump or an air dodge. It's funny, but taking the up airs and just taking the more damage than you would have rather than like air dodging, like that air dodge becomes a 50-50 whether you live or die, right? If it works, you take less damage immediately and maybe you'll even get a reversal. But not pressing anything guarantees you'll take more up airs, but you're not going to give them that cue to take your stock, right? And that's
Yep.
like a really easy example to start off with this perspective. So when you're in disadvantage, especially in hit stun, you want to judge the distance between the two of you and ask yourself, do I have to burn a resource right now, right? Because the longer you have those resources, the easier it will be to navigate yourself in disadvantage. But if you use one of your jumps or if you use your air dodge, it becomes a lot easier for not only for your opponent to get valuable hits, but also just track you, like when you're drifting in the air or whatever it may be. So that's the biggest thing to start off with. I think the hardest thing with this perspective is you have to know a decent amount of matchup knowledge to judge the distance between yourself and your opponent and ask like, do I have to burn something out of hit stun or not? But it's usually a pretty simple idea of, how close are they to me?
Yeah. Yeah. The characters that are really good at juggling, like Fox or Palu,
Exactly.
where you can't really escape until you take a couple hits. And for me, it's really being cognizant of where that opportunity is, right? Like, is
Yeah.
my percentage high enough where one
Mhm.
hit is good enough to get out of it, or take the next couple and then react accordingly? So yeah, I
There's a
agree.
couple perspectives with that, right? Like going back to where we started with like taking specific hits that guarantee survival, even though it's taking more damage, rather than taking that 50-50 of no damage or death, right? Like, you
Right.
want to avoid those, especially. It's not that they're not going to happen, but you don't want that to be the focal point of your disadvantage, right? That goes against the perspective of making them work for it, right? Like you're just boiling it down to like a really simple game of lose your stock or keep your stock. Um,
Yep.
and yeah, I like what you're saying. Like with Palu or Fox, like that kind of helps me transition into another disadvantage, like key thing I like to talk about, which is changing the phase of disadvantage, right? Because a big thing with Smash Ultimate and with disadvantage in general is players like to play the disadvantage state really fast, right? Out of hit stun, they're jumping, they're air dodging, they're very likely even landing on top of their opponent, right? They're trying to like, you know, not only are they trying to get out of disadvantage as fast as possible, they're trying to make up for that lost damage too, right? They want to get out
Right.
and they want to hit their opponent for hitting them. So they're not really changing the face of disadvantage, right? They're gonna land on top of their opponent, so they're doing the dirty work for them. The opponent doesn't have to juggle them or chase them. So like landing on different platforms, landing in the corner, even retreating to the ledge. It's not like this is the right or wrong answer to getting out of disadvantage, but you're really testing your opponent in different ways, right? How do they approach this situation? How do they platform pressure? How do they pressure a cornered opponent? How do they ledge trap? And it's not like this is, like I said, it's not like it's right or wrong, but you're getting a lot of data for future interactions, and you might find a hole in your opponent's gameplay that will lead to it being a consistent way of escaping. And a lot of players are so scared of being in that spot that they don't have the discipline to have that patience to consciously even think of it like that, right?
Right. Is that something where you should be more cognizant at like lower percentage? Because I feel like once I get up to like a higher percentage, I feel more comfortable in disadvantage state. One, because you know it's harder to follow up at a higher percentage. Yeah, at a higher percentage for me is like I even become more comfortable because you know there's I know they can't kill me as easy from those follow-ups, if that makes sense. But
basically it all comes down to where I started with the fact that you were using your resources really quickly out of hit stun. The more often you do this, the harder it is to play with the idea of collecting data on how your opponent likes to play an advantage, right? Because you just don't have tools to put them to the test and like change the phase of your disadvantage. And that's the reason why like I guess I started saying this in the first place. And another like core concept that I talk about in my MetaFi lessons is how similar winning and losing is in this game. Like for example, like it requires like very similar skill sets to hold a lead or to bring a game back from a deficit. For example, if you change the phase of your disadvantage, right? You're getting juggled and you're like, okay, I'm gonna land in the corner. And you're really testing your opponent's patience, right? Because even though you're cornered, your opponent has the privilege of they have all the stage to work with. They can play patient. They can just swing second and see how you try to escape the corner. They just have more stage to work with. But testing them is a good idea because maybe you'll realize, oh, they're actually pretty impatient right here. And they're actually cornering themselves or they're approaching me. And even though they're in such an advantageous position, a lot of players play their disadvantage so fast that they might not really test their opponent and even give themselves a chance to notice these flaws in their play. And it's funny because if they're in a losing position, a lot of players are in the mindset of, oh, I'm losing, I have to approach, I have to do X or Y because I'm losing. And there's a lot of truth to that. But since there's 7 minutes on the clock, there's actually a lot more to work with and there's a lot more to test your opponent on. You know, holding a lead or bringing a game back from a deficit are, you know, two sides of the same coin, essentially, is what I'm getting at.
Yep. Okay. I don't know if you see one of my further notes, but you kind of touched on it, is dealing with patient players, at least like recently, you know, going to playing with friends or somewhere or on that same level. You know, I struggle where with patient players where I have to be more cognizant of my mix-ups or not being so aggressive because I know they're waiting for me to attack or me to mess up and then they'll follow through, right? So patient players are or something that I'm trying to like fight against to be, I don't know, just be as patient as them, or finding a way to like bait and punish their kind of gameplay, patient gameplay, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's actually a lot to talk about when it comes to like this patient play you're talking about. So I'm actually going to start up a game, and like maybe I can like I can like position myself and visualize a couple like key ideas. So one thing with Smash Ultimate that I just notice a lot when I'm watching the game is a lot of the core mechanics, I think, kind of, I like to say, trick players into playing in a specific pacing or playing in a certain way. So first thing is, if you're playing against a patient player, right, they're going to try to swing second, and they're going to position themselves preemptively, and they're always going to be like a step ahead of someone who's like playing at a consistent like pacing or like swinging a lot, right? So a situation I like to talk about a lot, it's not as applicable with Cloud, but it can be pretty easy to describe regardless. So if we're like shield to shield, right? Like let's say I'm Sephiroth and I do a back air out of shield, right? Like a lot of players are probably going to do something like that, right? They're throwing out a hitbox while repositioning because they're a sword character. Makes complete sense. But let's say when we're shield to shield and I do the Sephiroth back air and you inch forward like you did right there. We're essentially back to where we started, right? Or if anything, I'm getting punished. So an interesting idea with Smash in general is to try to avoid these situations and take what I like to call like small victories, right? Like let's say instead of like throwing out a hitbox here, I just did like a defensive slingshot, right? So now not only am I repositioning that's more favorable for my sword character, I'm also collecting data to see if you were like repositioning yourself, right? Like are you inching forward? Are you staying stationary? Are you retreating? Because those like scrappy like shield to shield scenarios are so common, right? Because Smash Ultimate has a lot of low end lag. Shield grab is a lot slower than it was in the previous game. So you're gonna find yourself scrapping, and like it's like no one is really winning, right? It eventually just comes down to like a guessing game, right? Like who gets the hit. And the hardest thing about that is like what did you learn for next time, right? In reality, like really nothing, and it makes it hard to like beat those patient players that are just going to take a step back to, you know, step out of that zone, and they're just going to hit you over and over for like playing into the game's core mechanics, right?
Right.
So like taking small things like pre-positioning or like taking certain parts of the stage that are more favorable for you are a really big deal, rather than, you know, sometimes throwing out that hitbox, right? Because it puts you in so much lag that it might just, you know, the scenario might just play itself out again. And you're really missing out on collecting that data on how to really get into that patient player's head. I kind of like to call it the art of nothing, especially when I'm like, because I do a lot of lessons with Sephiroth players, and a lot of his moves are really slow. So you really start to find the value of just simple positioning, right, without even pressing buttons. And this can apply to everyone, but it's just a lot easier with like some of these sword characters, especially Sephiroth. But for example, going back to where I suggested like just retreating and jumping away rather than pressing a button, that moment is so key, right? Like let's say you continued to shield and you didn't do anything else, and because you were looking to like out of shield punish a move. That tells me a lot about the next time we're in close quarters, right? Maybe next time I'll do something like this, right? Maybe I'll come down with an empty hop grab. And like it gets the ball rolling for these players that aren't initiating, right? They're not like approaching you. They're not necessarily hitting your shield. They're not pressing any preemptive buttons. But the way you're positioning yourself starts to at least get the ball rolling for how to open them up, rather than swinging first yourself and, you know, really just leaving it up to them for like, you're basically letting them dictate the pace. They can decide if they want to control the stage, if they want to punish you, and that makes it really hard. So you're constantly going to be scrambling to be in a comfortable position yourself, because you're just going to be swinging first, and you're going to essentially be in more lag than them throughout the match, right? Because you're just pressing more buttons. And that's a big thing that when you're playing in a match with someone to notice, right? Like, are you chasing them? Are you scrambling a lot? Does it feel like they're like kind of controlling your pace? And there's a lot to dive into if you notice that, right? But obviously in the moment, it takes a lot of discipline to even notice that in the first place, because you might notice it, but it might be like the game's already over, right? Like, damn, like you were just a little too slow. So I guess like just starting to have this thought process in the first place is basically the starting point.
Okay. All right. I think I understand what you're saying.
It's honestly very similar to what we started with disadvantage, right? If you're so quick
Yeah.
to do that double jump out of hit stun, and they just start tracking you preemptively, it's going to be so hard for like the next like 30 seconds, whether you're getting hit or not, to just like really reposition yourself. And it could be the same thing for a character like Banjo too, or a character like the Lynx are a big one, right? Like let's say we're like about like this distance from each other, and I'm Link or Toon Link or whatever, and I just got out of hit stun. They're very often going to either throw a boomerang or pull out a bomb, right? Because that distance makes sense to start their natural game plan. But since they just got out of hit stun, you know, let's say you're Link doing that boomerang from right where you're standing, and then I just jump over you and I come in with an aerial, right? And my advantage state just keeps going just because of how preemptive your disadvantage state was. Rather than assessing the situation first and maybe even doing nothing at all would have been more valuable, right? Because when an opponent is playing against a character like Banjo, they know out of hit stun you want to use one of your jumps or you want to set up a projectile, right? And if I'm just pre-positioning around that, you're just never going to be comfortable, right? But if you stop first and acknowledge, are they pre-positioning for this or not? If they're not, then you can set it up, right? Like if I'm playing grounded and shield, then you set up the down B. But if I'm already preemptively like jumping in, like I'm tracking you and I want to get more hits, that's where those like projectile players really start to struggle because they're just like they're playing too deep into their own flowchart, right? Rather than playing against their opponent.
Yep, I see what you're saying.
It kind of all like I feel like a lot of the things we're saying all like can connect into each other in some way.
Nah. Oh, okay, that was bad input.
So there was a couple situations where I actively noticed you were like a bit more conscious with your disadvantage. Like for example, I think it was at the very start of the game. I hit you, and out of hit stun you did like a jump aerial, and then you retreated to the ledge while like setting up a pressure with a projectile, right? So you're giving me something to deal with while you grab the ledge, and that's like a great like example of good disadvantage because there's so many variables as to why it's effective, right? Not only are you resetting, disengaging, and like patiently accepting the fact that you're in disadvantage, you're giving me something to work with, like shield or like grab or get hit by the grenade like while you're grabbing ledge, and it might even give you a cue to get up. And that's a great like I wish I could show you the exact situation it was, but it was a great example of basically everything we just talked about. And something I want to mention that it's very similar to what I was saying about how similar being in a winning position and a losing position is in this game. I actually want to talk about your decision making while I'm on the ledge rather than you are on the ledge. Maybe I can go into another game and like visualize a couple things.
Okay.
So essentially, when I grab the ledge in these situations, I'm just trying to make the most of my ledge invincibility, right? And during this ledge invincibility, I just want to watch my opponent and see how they're approaching the situation, right? Because you can see a lot of intent with your opponent's positioning and or like what preemptive moves they're throwing out while you're in this spot. So for example, I was on the ledge, kind of just sitting, watching a couple times, and you like threw out a grenade, and then you like, or you like shielded or you air dodge, and like you would do like 2 or 3 moves. So the preemptivity of that basically just gives me a cue to pick an option that beats that, right? Like, oh, while you're air dodging or like catching the grenade or deploying the grenade, I just get up and just reposition. So basically what I'm saying is you want to find a balance of preemptively covering certain options and playing reactionary, right?
Yep.
And if you're a bit too preemptive with your ledge pressure, then I just get to get up for free. Kind of as if it's the quote-unquote right option, right? Because I'm just picking whatever beats what you do. But if you're not as preemptive with that, like let's say you do one less decision. Let's say you do one, just deploy the grenade and that's it. And you don't do the 2 or 3 things you did after. Now I have something that is pressuring me on the ledge, and you're not in enough of a frame disadvantage where I can just simply beat that, right? Like, I have to accept the fact I'm a disadvantage, and I have to work for it. And that's basically the goal when you're ledge trapping with any character. And if you're too preemptive, if we go back to when I was escaping the situation, I'm getting off the ledge, and I'm escaping the corner, right? Because that's how preemptive those options were. So not only are you not getting a ledge trap, you're not getting corner pressure either. And those 2 phases are, quote-unquote, supposed to be a guarantee in Smash, right? Everyone has to grab the ledge. Everyone has to escape the corner. It's really important to have a really sound game plan in these spots because they're going to happen. They're universal. And you get so much data in these situations. Because even if you don't get a super crazy hit or kill in this situation this time, if you play it out and collect a lot of data, maybe you'll know what to do next time and really make your opponent hurt, right? And that's really why I'm mentioning the balance between preemptivity and reactions. Not only to get hits during your ledge trap, but to make sure they are still cornered by the time they get up. Like, you are still controlling the majority of the stage. Because if you're too preemptive, you're going to lose out on a lot. And you're going to miss out on a lot of crucial data, right?
Okay.
And the same thing for if you're the one on the ledge. This still really applies because, like I said, like we were talking about, a lot of players in Smash Ultimate, they play the disadvantage really fast, and the ledge is no exception. So maybe their opponent is really preemptive with their ledge trapping, but they'll never notice that because they get up into hitboxes, or they're just playing it really fast. They're not making the most of their ledge invincibility, and they're kind of just, fighting for their life rather than like, taking note of what their opponent's doing in the first place, right?
Right. Okay.
So it definitely goes both ways. And you also mentioned a couple things like bait and punish and movement mix-ups. And I feel like there's a couple things we already talked about that kind of connect into that, right? Well, a big one is like with bait and punish is baiting whether you're going to like deploy the grenade or shoot the projectile or not, right? Whenever you're at that range where it's a possibility, you have to ask yourself, do I want to actually do it, or do I want to bait them and not do it at all and like reposition myself into an even better, like more favorable position, right? Because an easy example, because it's my main, is Diddy Kong, and obviously Banana is like a huge deal. And when I'm playing, I'll be at a range where I could pull Banana, but they also could hit me if they fully committed to it, right? If they really wanted to stop the banana pull. So I'm always asking myself whether I'm hitting my opponent and whether I want to push my advantage or like go pull a banana, or we're neutral and there's enough space to do it, is really ask myself, what can my opponent do about it? Is it worth pulling in the first place? How has the pacing been throughout the match? Or should I, go fight without it? So there's a lot of questions you can ask yourself before doing that move that you're usually relying on in neutral. And I feel like I mentioned it just because a lot of projectile characters are so quick to just deploy it that they're really not asking themselves enough questions before they do it. Because there's so much data just because your opponent is preemptively playing around the fact that you're likely to do it, right? So there's so much advantage you can gain before you even press any buttons.
True. That's one of my supposedly game plan is at least with Banjo is the bomb management, and try to play around the bomb by either, like you said, deploying it and letting it kind of bounce and to see what the opponent does, or grabbing it, or kind of mixing up those two options between grabbing or letting it bounce, or a combination of two,
Yeah.
and try to be tricky with that. Obviously, it's a timer with the bomb, so you can't hold it on forever. But
Yeah.
at least that is part of one of my game plans.
Exactly, and like
Inspiration.
you can have a similar frame of thought without even deploying it, right? Like all these mix-ups you
Yeah.
have when you deploy it, you can have a similar frame of thought before you even press it, just because your opponent is fully aware of how these functions work too, right? That's why they're trying to
Hmm.
hit you before you can even do it, or hit you during the animation or something like that. So
Yep.
it's really important to consider that moment before you even press it. Just like what we were talking about with like, you know, jumping out of disadvantage, or like the preemptivity of it all. It's really important. Like those moments are just as important as when you do have everything set up. You know what I mean?
Yep. Okay. Great feedback. Definitely taking notes. So appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Ah, okay. Okay. A lot of projectiles out there.
Yeah.
Banjo and Diddy are semi-related.
Yeah,
Both.
I'm a big banjo fan.
I know. I'm bummed that there's no top players with the banjo.
Yeah, that is unfortunate.
Woohoo! Do you mind one more?
I actually do have another Metafy lesson like right now. But one thing I didn't get to mention that I wanted to mention is if you have any questions, whether it's about anything we talked about today, because I know a lot of it was like very universal topics, feel free to send me a message anytime if you have any questions. Other than that, I hope today helped in some way, but I do have another lesson right now, so.
Yeah, no, this was great. I really appreciate your time. I'll probably follow up with a different lesson a couple weeks from now. But
Okay.
yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
These are great. You're one of the best players out there.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Uh,
Have a good one,
good about
and
this.
thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
See ya. GG's. Banjo is the GOAT.